When my wife and I bought our house 4 years ago, we thought we'd landed exactly what we wanted. It was an older place in a quiet American neighborhood, nothing fancy but solid. The inspection came back clean, the appraisal went through, the city signed off, and we moved in without much concern. There was one thing that seemed odd, though. Our neighbor had a fence running from the front corner of his house all the way across his driveway to the front corner of ours. At first glance, it looked normal enough, but once we settled in, I realized something strange. That fence blocked access to a narrow strip of land that actually belonged to us, roughly 30 feet long and 4 feet wide. Technically, it was our property. Practically speaking, it looked like his yard. Grass covered it, and he mowed it regularly, so I figured maybe previous owners had some sort of agreement. Nobody mentioned easements, nobody said anything during closing. I figured it wasn't worth making a fuss. Then came the rain. That year, our area got hit with what the news kept calling historic rainfall. You know the type. Storms so bad they get labeled once in 100 years, except apparently those happen every 6 months now. After the third major storm, I noticed moisture creeping into our basement. Nothing cataclysmic, just enough water to make me nervous. I walked outside and checked that side of the house. Sure enough, the grading sloped slightly toward our foundation, not dramatically, but enough to channel water where I didn't want it. I decided to do the responsible homeowner thing. In spring, I hired a landscaping crew. The plan was simple: regrade the soil, slope water away from the house, install drainage, keep water from ending up in either basement or driveway. Everybody wins. The crew showed up and got started. About 20 minutes later, I heard shouting. I walked outside and saw my neighbor standing there red-faced and furious. He looked about 60, but had the energy and appearance of a man who'd been angry since 1987. He was yelling at the workers. "What are you idiots doing on my property?" The crew looked confused. One guy said, "Sir, we were hired by the homeowner." Neighbor pointed at the ground. "This isn't his." Now this caught me off guard, because over the previous year, multiple people had accessed that exact side of the house. Cable installers, siding contractors, plumbers. Nobody ever got yelled at. Nobody was told to leave, but apparently dirt work crossed some invisible line. I walked over and explained that this was our property, and we were improving drainage. He kept arguing. The workers eventually shrugged and continued. They regraded everything, tilled the soil, spread fresh mulch, and even left it looking nice enough to become a future flower bed. Problem solved. Or so I thought. The following year, my wife planted roses there. Nothing extravagant, just enough to make the area look intentional instead of forgotten. Later that season, we hired a landscaping company for a full yard cleanup. They got to that side of the house, and right on schedule, out came the neighbor. He stormed outside screaming, started accusing workers of destroying his yard. Then things got weird. At one point, he took what can only be described as a half-hearted swing at one of the landscapers, and then, for reasons still unexplained, started yelling racial insults, calling them dirty Mexicans. The landscaping crew? 3 white guys from the suburbs. Nobody understood what was happening. I came outside. He immediately switched targets, started calling me a bitch, repeatedly, demanded I pay to resod his yard. I refused. Eventually, I told the crew to skip that side. No point escalating. Later that night, my wife and I talked. Her position was simple. If he wants ownership of that area so badly, let him deal with it. Fair enough, so we stopped touching it. No watering, no weeding, no maintenance. By midsummer, the weeds were pushing 4 feet tall. Honestly, you couldn't even see them from the street, so I didn't care. Apparently he did. This spring came around wetter than usual. The neglected strip turned into knee-high jungle by May. One Saturday, I was mowing the front lawn. I noticed movement. My neighbor climbed over the fence. Not opened, climbed. Walked right up into my space. Stood practically nose to nose with me. "When are you going to clean this crap up?" I shut off the mower. I looked at him and said, "When I know workers won't get harassed, I'll clean it." Wrong answer. His face turned red. Again came the bitch comments, this time with bonus accusations of laziness. I shrugged and said, "Call the city." Then I turned around and kept mowing. He stood there another minute yelling at nobody, then stomped off. I figured that was the end of it. I was very wrong. The next afternoon, code enforcement knocked on my door, and suddenly things got interesting.
The code enforcement officer looked exactly like every city inspector I've ever met. Clipboard, neutral expression, zero interest in neighborhood drama. He introduced himself politely and said, "Afternoon, we received a complaint regarding overgrown weeds." I nodded. "Okay." He looked around. Trimmed front lawn, flower beds, clean sidewalks, fresh mulch. He glanced back at me. "I'm not gonna lie, I'm not really sure why I'm here." I almost laughed. Then he added, "Can you show me where the complaint is?" Now, I could have played dumb, could have acted confused, could have let him wander around, but I figured if somebody took time out of their day because my neighbor decided to weaponize city services, I'd at least make the visit efficient. So I led him around the side. As soon as we rounded the corner, he stopped walking. His eyes moved from the weeds to the fence, then back to the property line. He squinted, then stepped closer. He looked at the fence again, then looked at me. "How long has this been here?" I shrugged. "Long before we bought the house." He asked if I knew where the property line was. I explained what we'd learned after buying the place, showed him the survey documents, showed him where the line actually ran, showed him how that narrow strip belonged entirely to us. He looked at the fence again, then let out one of those quiet government worker sighs that means somebody just created paperwork. "Well," he pointed, "nothing I can really cite you for," then pointed at the fence. "But this?" Pause. "This is a problem." I stayed quiet. Never interrupt professionals. He walked closer, measured visually, made notes, looked at access, looked at encroachment, took photos, then casually asked, "So he built this onto your property?" I said, "Looks that way." The officer nodded, then started writing. A lot. I finally asked, "So what happens?" He smiled the way somebody smiles when they're about to ruin someone's week professionally. "He'll receive notice." I asked for what? The officer started counting. Unauthorized encroachment, fence compliance, property access issues, vegetation maintenance. Then he looked over the neighbor's side, raised an eyebrow. His patio looked rough. Weeds growing between pavers, grass creeping onto sidewalks, edges completely ignored. The officer wrote more. He looked back at me. "Interesting he called us." Then he handed me his card. "If he gives you trouble, call." And he left. I went inside, told my wife. She stared for half a second, then said, "He reported himself?" "Pretty much." We didn't think much of it after that, until the next morning. Knock, knock. I opened the door. Standing there, neighbor's wife. Now, unlike him, she'd always seemed normal, quiet, polite, mostly invisible. She looked embarrassed, not angry, embarrassed. She asked if she could talk. I stepped outside. She explained that the city had come. They'd gotten notices. Fence had to come down, patio had to be cleaned, sidewalk edged, deadline 10 days. She paused, then asked, "Would you be willing to split the cost of removing the fence?" Now, if this had happened before 2 years of yelling, before workers being harassed, before being called names repeatedly, before someone literally filing complaints against me, I probably would have said yes. But timing matters, and apparently she picked the wrong week. I smiled politely and said, "Sorry, us bitches are out of charity money." She stared for half a second, then laughed, actually laughed, shook her head, said, "Fair enough," and walked away. That afternoon, construction began. Only there were no contractors, no crew, no rental equipment, just my neighbor, outside, sweating, disassembling his own fence, the same fence he'd defended like national territory. Every screw looked personal. Every board came off with visible anger. I pretended not to notice. Worked from home, left windows open, could hear occasional muttering, couldn't make out words, but based on tone, not positive. By day 2, things got better. Apparently removing decades-old fence posts in summer heat isn't easy, so phone calls started. I overheard enough to piece together the situation. His adult kids were being recruited. Apparently emergency family labor had been activated. One of them showed up, then another. Now there were 3 grown adults trying to remove something that never should have been there. Watching them was educational. Nobody looked happy. At one point I heard, "Dad, why did you even call?" Excellent question. Nobody answered. That evening my wife looked out the window and said, "You know what's funny?" I asked what. She said, "If he'd just let people work over there, none of this would have happened." And she was right. We weren't trying to reclaim territory. We weren't threatening lawsuits. We literally improved drainage, added flowers, paid for landscaping. All he had to do was nothing. Instead, he escalated. Again and again, until eventually he invited the government over to inspect our yard and accidentally introduced them to his own violations. By the end of the week, the fence was gone. For the first time since buying the house, I could actually walk down the full side in my own property, and seeing it open gave me an idea. Not revenge, not exactly, but definitely not generosity, because now I had decisions to make, and I already knew exactly what I wasn't putting back there.
By the time the fence finally came down, the entire side of the house looked different. Not prettier, just unfamiliar. For 4 years, that space had mentally belonged to somebody else. even though legally it was ours. You get used to strange things when you live somewhere long enough. I'd gotten used to seeing his mower over there, used to pretending the property line wasn't where it actually was, used to not thinking about it. Now, suddenly, there was open space, 30 feet of it, and for the first time since moving in, I could walk the entire length without squeezing between fence posts or asking permission from someone who didn't own it. I stood there looking at the roses. Nice roses, healthy, good placement, good soil, completely wasted, because the whole reason they existed was to make that hidden area look nice. And suddenly I realized I didn't care anymore. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted revenge. I just no longer felt interested in maintaining a decorative space for someone who clearly hated seeing people enjoy it. So I made a plan. The roses would stay, just not there. Saturday morning, I grabbed gloves, a shovel, and started digging. A few minutes later, I noticed movement next door. Neighbor appeared. No yelling, no insults, just watching. I carefully dug around each rose, lifted them out, and moved them to a visible spot in our backyard where we could actually enjoy them. One by one. He kept watching, didn't say anything, which honestly felt stranger than the arguments. Then came the mulch. I shoveled out all the decorative mulch we'd paid for, loaded it into a wheelbarrow, moved it elsewhere. By lunch, the flower bed was gone. Now all that remained was dirt. The neighbor finally spoke. "What are you doing?" I answered honestly. "Changing the landscaping." He stared. No follow-up. Just disappeared inside. That afternoon, I rolled out landscaping fabric, measured, cut, pinned everything down. Then I ordered several loads of pea gravel. Nothing fancy, nothing ugly, no flowers, no edging, no decorative borders. Just clean stone. Low maintenance, functional. The kind of thing that says, this space exists, but nobody is trying to impress anybody. When the gravel arrived, I spread it evenly. By evening, the whole strip looked finished. Simple, neat, completely neutral. My wife came outside, looked at it, nodded. "You know what?" "What?" "I actually like it better." And honestly, same. No weeds, no mowing, no watering, no pretending. Just done. A few days passed. Then something unexpected happened. Nothing. No arguments, no complaints, no comments. For the first time since moving in, peace. I think once the fence disappeared, reality set in. The invisible line became visible. The area he'd treated like his stopped being his. There wasn't really anything left to argue about. Then one afternoon, I was out front trimming bushes when his son walked over. Not the neighbor. His son. Middle-aged guy. Looked tired. He stood awkwardly for a second, then said, "Sorry about all that." I shrugged. "It happens." He laughed, then said, "He does this." Apparently this wasn't new. According to him, his dad had spent years starting tiny neighborhood wars. Property lines, leaves, trash cans, fence heights. Some people collect stamps. Some collect grudges. His dad apparently specialized in conflict. Then he said something that stuck with me. "You'd be surprised how often things get worse because people can't leave well enough alone." That felt accurate. Because if you zoom out, this entire thing started over absolutely nothing. Nobody challenged the fence. Nobody demanded access. Nobody complained. Nobody reported him. All he had to do, for years, was continue quietly existing. Instead, he picked fights, harassed workers, insulted people, demanded control over land he didn't own, then invited city attention, which led directly to consequences, all self-inflicted. That's the funny thing about people who constantly threaten authority. Sometimes authority shows up, and sometimes authority doesn't side with them. Now every time I mow, I walk right down that side. No fence, no drama, just gravel. Sometimes I see him outside. We don't really talk. He doesn't call me names anymore. I don't bring up the fence. Neither of us mentions code enforcement. The roses are thriving in the backyard. The basement stays dry. And that strip of land? It finally looks like what it always should have been. Mine. Not because I fought for it. Not because I won. Just because eventually somebody got so committed to being difficult that they accidentally solved the problem themselves. Turns out the fastest way to lose control is trying too hard to control everything.